Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we probably are covering multiple time zones today. Welcome to today's Mackinder Forum. My name is Dr. Scott Smithson. I'm the Mackinder Forum coordinator for the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as the professor and director of the Grand Strategy Program at Denison University, and the founder and chief strategy officer for Geopolitics Incorporated, which is a private geopolitical risk and advisory firm. A little bit of house rules before we get started. Our initial conversation will be recorded today and posted to the Mackinder Forum YouTube channel. Please feel free to refer interested friends and colleagues to the lectures that are posted on this site. Before introducing our guest, I'd like to remind everyone here on this call that we do adhere to the Chatham House rule, which applies also to the question and answer session following the talk. The Q&A is not recorded, but we want to continue to honor the Chatham House rule for the Q&A portion. The Chatham House rule states participants in the Mackinder Forum event are free to use information from the discussion, but they are not allowed to reveal who made any particular comment or mention what organization they represent. Regarding the Q&A that follows the talk, the organizers, we request that participants limit themselves to one question at a time. If possible, we'll return to a questioner before his session ends if he or she has a follow-on question to ask. In addition, the temptation to lecture the other participants by way of offering a long introduction to question should not be indulged. Len always reminds us that we have a culture of civility within the forum. Finally, if you do not have an opportunity to end yourself during the meet and greet session that we just wrapped up, please do so briefly before you ask your question. Your name and affiliation are sufficient. So to switch now that we have the rules out of the way, we are very, very honored and excited to have with us today, welcome Colonel Retired Mike Burgoyne to the Mackinder Forum. Mike is a retired U.S. Army colonel and assistant professor of practice at the University of Arizona's School of Government and Public Policy. He's deployed twice to Iraq in command and staff position and served as the defense attaché in Kabul, Afghanistan. Mike was a counterinsurgency trainer at the National Training Center and co-authored the work The Defense of Jisr al-Duraya, a tactical primer on counterinsurgency. He has served in various policy and security cooperation positions in the Americas, including assignments as the Army attaché in Mexico, the Andean Ridge desk officer at U.S. Army South, the senior defense official in Guatemala, and policy analyst at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Colonel Burgoyne holds an MA in Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College and an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University. His research and writing focus on security in the Western Hemisphere, insurgency, transnational organized crime, alliances, and defense policy. He is currently pursuing a PhD in War Studies at King's College London, and as a former U.S. Southern Command, U.S. Southcom strategy officer, we are very, very fortunate to have someone of Mike's deep and rich background within the Western Hemisphere to talk about these dynamics that are as relevant as they are timely. Mike, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Mackinder Forum. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks for having me. We don't have a huge group today, so it's kind of like as I think of the name that I put for this thing, Alliances in the Americas, I'm already thinking what I need to do is add something more sexy like drugs or explosions or something. We pivoted to Asia and then we just pivoted to Latin America. I'm sure when you booked me, you guys were like, hey, this is going to be great. We got a Latin America person here. We can talk all about what's happening in Venezuela, and that's the new hot topic in DC. But we're back in the Middle East again, so we're going to talk about Latin America, but I'm going to try to convince you that the Western Hemisphere is a really important place and is vital to the international order that we've all enjoyed for so many years. All right, so now the hardest part of this is me making sure I can share my slides. Let me see if I can pull this off. All right, so let's start. I'm going to start just by going over some of the things that have been happening in the hemisphere in case you've missed them. So the Trump administration in the second term has taken some bold steps in the Western Hemisphere. So we've had the creation of Joint Task Force Southern Border near me here in Tucson. It's based out of Huachuca. They've had some 12,000 active duty troops on the border. Also, Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartel has been stood up. That's located in Tucson at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. So we used to have a thing called Joint Task Force North, which was located in El Paso, that would do the coordination along the border region. And everyone's talked about building a joint interagency task force forever. But there's a lot of issues with how you get everybody to coordinate and a lot of different bureaucratic issues. But they've created Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartel. It's a new organization. We're going to see how it does. And where it's actually working, I think is still a little bit unclear. In Mexico, on 22 February, you had the El Mencho raid, where the Mexican forces killed El Mencho, who's the leader of the cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, which is the largest, most powerful narco trafficking criminal organization in Mexico. So no direct action by the U.S. there, but supported, and also the Mexicans even acknowledged the support, which was interesting. In the Caribbean and the Pacific, the administration has been conducting lethal strikes on alleged drug boats. They've killed more than 160 people in that action, including, I think, yesterday or the day before, we killed another two in a lethal strike. This is happening through Joint Task Force Southern Spear, which at one point included an amphibious readiness group, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, and a carrier strike group. Now, since then, the carrier strike group, the Ford, crossed the Atlantic again and then took part in the operations with Iran. And I'm not sure how much longer that ARG and that MEU are going to hang around in the Caribbean. And then perhaps most importantly, Operation Absolute Resolve on 3 January 2026, massive military raid led to the capture of Nicolas Maduro, the strongman leader of Venezuela, that's been a problem for the United States for a long time and the region. In addition, the United States threatened Panama, Colombia, Mexico, and incredibly Greenland with military force in the second term. The new policy unilateral action was codified in the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, often referred to as the Monroe Doctrine. And this doctrine asserts that the American people, not foreign nations nor globalist institutions, will always control their own destiny in our hemisphere. And a more concise way of putting this is what President Trump said right after the Maduro raid. He said, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. So a really muscular stance from the administration now. And there's two meetings I want to highlight because I think this might have slipped through the cracks because this was happening right when Iran was heating up. These are two meetings that I think were driving engagement for the administration, what the administration's policy is going to be. And Marco Rubio laid out how he felt we should be working in the hemisphere prior to the inauguration. And I think we're going down this road. And so these two meetings are important. The first one is this military conference at Southern Command on 5 March 2026. You had 17 countries, including the United States, sign the America's Counter-Cartel Conference Joint Security Declaration. Now, I want to highlight that this is not a treaty. These are ministers of defense, and it's a declaration. So this is not a treaty. No legislatures are going to ratify this, but it is a statement by these ministers. And what they said was that they will expand multilateral and bilateral cooperation to enhance security in the Western Hemisphere. Cooperate in the following areas: whole of government efforts regarding border security, countering narco-terrorism and trafficking, securing critical infrastructure, and other areas to be mutually determined. They're going to advance peace through strength to address future threats to our mutual interests, and they're going to join a coalition to combat narco-terrorism and other shared threats to the Western Hemisphere. So this was followed up 2 days later in Doral. So we're still in Miami here, but now they kind of changed locations. And they do this Shield of the Americas conference with heads of state. So you have 12 heads of state in attendance: Trinidad and Tobago, Paraguay, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guyana, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Honduras, Chile, and Panama. In this, there's remarks by the Secretary of State. So Secretary Rubio speaks, Secretary Hegseth from Department of Defense speaks, President Trump speaks at length. And then this is followed by, if anybody saw this or you've seen pictures of it on the news, you can see a picture there on the screen of all the heads of state at the Shield of the Americas conference with the awesome logo. So it looks like they're signing a joint declaration or some kind of a joint document, a multilateral document. President Trump is there at a table signing something, and everyone's behind him. And I had to clarify this several times because it didn't make any sense to me, but this isn't a multilateral document. None of the other heads of state signed this thing. What's really happening there is Trump, while everybody's watching, is signing a unilateral proclamation. And so what that proclamation says, what that declaration by the president says, it refers back to the document from 2 days prior and discusses it as a pledge from military leaders and representatives from 17 countries, demonstrating that the region is ready to operationalize hard power to defeat these threats to our security and civilization. Now, I'll note, though, that the Counter Cartel Conference Declaration doesn't say they're going to use hard power. So he's taking that document and then inferring that that means they're going to use military force. And in the speeches at the Counter Cartel Conference, Stephen Miller was there and Hegseth was there, and there was a very clear line that, hey, we want to use military force against these organizations. I can't remember if it was Miller or if it was Hegseth. Basically said, hey, if you don't want to use military force, just tell us where they are and we will do it for you. So at least in the public statements, there's a very clear push that we want to use military force as the tool that we're going to use to go after these organizations. This proclamation, this unilateral proclamation goes on. It says criminal cartels and foreign terrorist organizations in the Western Hemisphere should be demolished to the fullest extent possible, consistent with applicable law. And it says the United States will train and mobilize partner nation militaries to achieve the most effective fighting force necessary to dismantle cartels and their ability to export violence and pursue influence through organized intimidation. So this is the direction we're going. And I think to understand if this U.S. policy is going to be effective or if there's any risks involved, I think we have to put it in some historical context. And I'm told that we can do we can raise hands in this thing. So I'm going to see if we can play a game here because we have a lot of very smart people in this room. So if everybody could just do the hand raise thing, and then we'll take them down as you get further along. And I'm going to go through some things and tell you to take your hand down as we go. So if everybody just raises their hand, we're going to see how this works. So the first one is, if you know about the Monroe Doctrine, leave your hand up. If you've ever heard of the Monroe Doctrine, leave your hand up. So probably everybody's going to have their hand up, right? Everybody's heard of the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, if you've heard of the Roosevelt Corollary, keep your hand up. If you haven't heard of it, you got to take your hand down. Okay, if you've heard of the good neighbor policy, keep your hand up. If you haven't, take your hand down. All right, if you've heard of the Organization of American States, you can keep your hand up. If you haven't, you got to take your hand down. Okay, people are looking good so far. But now I'm about to get you. If you've heard of the Rio Treaty, you can keep your hand up. If you haven't heard of the Rio Treaty, you got to put your hand down. Yeah, we're losing people. We're losing people fast. Okay, and then kind of for the bonus points here, if you've heard of the only corollary, you get to keep your hand up. And if anybody keeps their hand up, I'm not sure if I believe you because nobody's heard of this thing. I did half my dissertation work and I hadn't heard of it. Okay, yeah, so I guess what's interesting about the way we think about the policy in the region is it's like every American has heard of the Monroe Doctrine because it's like the one thing we learn in junior high school or high school about our policy in the Western Hemisphere is like the Monroe Doctrine. And if you're in the AP classes or something, maybe you pick up the Roosevelt Corollary. And it's amazing to me how much the Monroe Doctrine still drives our policy in the region. When we think about how we deal with Asia or Europe, we're usually not going back to 1823, right? But with our policy in the Americas, we're constantly going back to 1823. And the Monroe Doctrine is deeply misunderstood. So what happens is all these Latin American nations break off from, they have the same thing. They have a revolution. They get away from Spain, from the colonial powers in Europe, just like the United States. Everybody's looking to keep the Europeans out. They don't want the Europeans to come back in and try to recolonize or to try to create new colonies in some spaces that are ungoverned. And so everyone's like, how do we deal with this? And the United States with Monroe says, hey, it's our policy that we don't want Europeans or their systems in our hemisphere. Now, the Monroe the United States cannot enforce this. We actually depend on the British Navy to help us enforce this policy. But it's well received in the hemisphere. Like people in the hemisphere, like Simon Bolivar is all for it. Like everyone's very happy with this. It's a unilateral doctrine, but everyone's like, hey, this is good policy. We like this. We don't want the Europeans here. So the Monroe Doctrine is about excluding the rest of really Europe from colonizing, causing problems in the hemisphere. So it's generally, if people like it, right? It's seen that way. Now, how we think about it, I think, has evolved, but we're really talking about some different policies. We're talking about in 1904, you have an issue with European powers all around the world, but also in the Western Hemisphere. If they have a debt, like a country owes them a debt, they'll do gunboat diplomacy. They'll come in, they'll threaten the country with military violence, they'll seize custom houses, they'll occupy port cities or occupy other terrain, and then they'll force the government to basically pay them back the debts that they're owed or debts owed to citizens. And this happened several times in Latin American history. But in 1904, some of this is actually due to what's happening with Venezuela. But so Theodore Roosevelt's like, okay, look, I got a problem here. I can't have Europeans coming in and occupying port cities in the Western Hemisphere. So what he basically says is, well, if you have a problem with countries in the hemisphere, we'll deal with it. The United States will deal with this problem. You're not allowed to deal with it. So it's still exclusionary. They still just don't want like these European powers coming in. They don't want Germany occupying ports in Venezuela or something like this. So it's still geared for independence for the region, but it really changes how we think about unilateral action in the hemisphere. And what they talk about is that the U.S. can engage in the region in the case of, I quote, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, end quote. And specifically, what it does is instead of being defensive, it's very much so interventionist in that it creates a unilateral right to the, and I quote, exercise of an international police power by the United States. So it sets us up this policy as if there's a problem in the hemisphere, we're going to go deal with it. Uh, Now, in World War One, jumping forward to World War One, the response to the Americas is pretty fractured, right? So we have this policy of intervention. We get this fractured response to World War One. Only 8 American states declare war on Germany, and other than the United States, Brazil is really the only country that does anything, and they do some naval patrolling in the South Atlantic that's useful, but that's really it. And then at the end of World War One, the United States becomes this kind of hegemonic, great power, finds itself in a different power position, which is going to affect how the region thinks of the United States. But in the interwar period, Franklin Delano Roosevelt he turns the page on the Roosevelt Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, and goes for the good neighbor policy. And the good neighbor policy basically says, hey, we're gonna stop, doing unilateral intervention in the hemisphere. If there's a problem, we're going to talk to you about it. We'll consult and we'll figure out what we're going to do together, and then we'll take action. And this really reduces a lot of anxiety in the region towards, U.S. unilateral action. And there's a massive diplomatic effort by the United States and also by the countries in the region to build a cohesive hemispheric security defense arrangement in the face of in a world that's getting more dangerous, right? And then in 1940, you have the Declaration of Havana, which is the first real defense agreement or like mutual defense agreement, a hemispheric one among the countries. And you see it in the World War II response. Much more unified response. Brazil deploys a task force and fights in Italy under U.S. command. That includes an aviation element, about a division's worth of troops, and they also continue with naval support. And then the Mexicans send the 201st Squadron, fighter squadron, which fights in the Philippines towards the end of the war. And diplomatically, the support is extensive through the whole region, with only a few holdouts, most notably Argentina. But so you see this good response in World War II, and then coming out of World War II in 1947, we signed the Rio Treaty, and the Rio Treaty is signed right outside of Rio de Janeiro. All the countries come together and they sign this thing called the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. And there's 3 key points there. So it is a defensive pact. It has in Article 3 an attack on was an attack on all, just like Article 5, like NATO. This predates NATO. And so you have the Washington Treaty, you have the NATO Treaty and Organization. That's all coming out of basically a cut and paste from the Rio Treaty. That's the starting point for our alliance with NATO. This predates NATO and sets up NATO. So it has that attack on one as attack on all. The region took some steps to avoid entrapment, but the U.S. pushed for this thing called Article 6, which means like even if there's something global that's happening or there's something happening that's not a specific aggression, the region's required to get together and consult on what they're going to do about it. Probably the most important piece of this is that the alliance is built on divergent interests and not a direct threat. So the United States coming out of World War II is this massive power. It doesn't really need to consolidate military forces to do what it needs to do. And it has this thing called the no benefit doctrine where it's not quite sure how much it needs these forces in the region to help it. But what it wants is legitimacy. And I think if you look at look at it kind of from Thucydides' standpoint, what the United States is it's not seeking arche, it's not seeking control, it's more looking for hegemonia, legitimated leadership from the Rio Treaty. So what it wants is the region to say, hey, we're good with the United States. That's the superpower we're going to stick with, and we're going to work together with them. And it's not going to be a debate between them and the Soviet Union. And it just kind of takes the region off of the plate of problems that the United States has. So it's extremely useful in that way. And it's been useful in that way since its inception in 47, even though we take it for granted. But there's some real problems with the Rio Treaty. So the Rio Treaty signed in 47. The very next year in 48 in Bogota, you have the OAS charter is put together in the Bogota conference. The idea was you take the Rio Treaty and basically put it underneath the OAS charter and like be fully integrated. They had a very ambitious plan for what they were going to get done in Bogota. This gets complicated by the fact that a politician gets killed in Bogota, which ignites the Bogotazo, which later leads to La Violencia. So you have this massive upsurge in violence and rioting in the capital. But the diplomats stay there, which is, and you read about it, it's fascinating how they kind of stick it out and stay there, marshals there. And so they sign the OAS charter, but they don't quite get it fully linked. Like the Rio Treaty and the OAS charter aren't fully linked. So they're different documents, but they kind of tie, they have a circular thing where they reach back to each other to function. And there's some key things that don't get created. So there's no standing military body. And then this thing called the Inter-American Defense Board, which was created during World War II, is a grouping of officers designed to kind of like coordinate efforts among the militaries in the hemisphere. During World War II, it's really sidelined. You actually have the chief of staff of the army says, the War Department tells them, hey, we'd rather they just be a social club. And you've got the Navy Department says, hey, they're welcome to make recommendations as long as we don't have to follow them, right? And so the IADB, the Inter-American Defense Board, they continue with it, but it's given no real authority still, even in the OAS Charter and this kind of combining of the Rio Treaty and the OAS Charter. There's no standing military staff or no standing military force. Unlike where NATO is going to end up with staffs, forces, the Atlantic Council, none of this is developed within the OAS as far from a security standpoint. The system of an organ of consultation, which is what the Rio Treaty has in case of your need to use the Rio Treaty, this gets kind of turned into a mix of meetings of foreign ministers, the use of the permanent OAS Council, but there's no standing structure for security as part of the treaty. And this becomes problematic throughout its existence. And during the Cold War, the Rio Treaty gets tested in a few different ways that probably people weren't thinking about. But Korea kicks off in 1950. The OAS tells its members to prepare military forces and send troops. Colombia sends troops. And so Colombia sends a battalion to Korea. And if you go to the Ministry of Defense, actually, I think they're moving buildings, but they used to have a big monument to their participation in Colombia. They're very proud of that, or in Korea. So they're very proud of that support there. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis starts. And they do the Rio Treaty. And so they enact the Rio Treaty. They invoke the Rio Treaty. They authorize the use of force. 12 countries volunteer military forces. Argentina, Dominican Republic, and Venezuela actually send ships. And then jumping forward to 1965, the Dominican Republic is facing instability. There's a risk that a communist government or a Cuban-supported government is going to take charge there. The OAS is very slow and not moving quickly to address this issue. So Lyndon Johnson complains about this. It's actually, if you can find it online, they have the audio, which is really fun to listen to. But he basically says the OAS ain't worth a damn except window dressing. So not a huge fan of where things were going with the OAS at that point. And so then he launches Operation Power Pack and does unilateral intervention, which is contrary to the good neighbor policy and the OAS charter and everything else we just got done putting together. But the OAS does follow up, and they build the Inter-American Peace Force, which is led by Brazil, although there's a massive U.S. contingent in there. And they stabilize the country, and they get to elections. A couple other quick ones: the Falklands War, the Guerra de las Malvinas. Argentina loses that war to the UK. I think it's hard for Argentina to argue that the Rio Treaty should have responded to help them, in that when the Rio Treaty signed, everyone acknowledges that this piece of terrain is contested. So it's kind of outside of that. And also, the Rio Treaty is not an offensive pact. It's a defensive pact. And so I think there's some problems with that, but that doesn't really matter because the perception is that the UK was fighting a Latin American state, and the Rio Treaty and the allies in the region didn't really come together to help them. And even that the US reluctantly helped the UK deal with Argentina. So that causes friction. Then you got the invasion of Panama in 1989, clearly unilateral, but justified as self-defense by the H.W. Bush administration. because of the threat to the U.S. folks in the Panama Canal. OAS doesn't really buy that argument. They vote 20-1 to censure the action. The one is the United States. And then closer to our time period here, 9/11, the United States received diplomatic support after 9/11. So the Rio Treaty gets invoked after 9/11. They get counterterrorism cooperation. But the only country from the region that deploys forces to Afghanistan is going to be El Salvador. And for Iraq, you get El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Dominican Republic do send forces to Iraq. They go with the Spanish. Those they only stay for one tour, except for El Salvador. El Salvador does 11 tours, 11 rotations of troops through Iraq. So El Salvador was very involved in the war on terror. And then the latest Rio Treaty kind of activity is in 2018. You had the presidential elections in Venezuela are highly contested. The National Assembly, because of this, doesn't recognize Maduro and puts Juan Guaido forward as the interim president or the acting president. The National Assembly is then declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Tribunal in Venezuela. But the OAS takes action. The OAS declares that it doesn't recognize Maduro's legitimacy beginning from 10 January 2019, which is when his term was up. And also, the OAS accepts Guaido's representative to the OAS instead of Maduro's representative. So there's some action taken there. But in the end, they don't get rid of Maduro, even though this is during the Trump administration's first big push to get rid of Maduro with this, maximum pressure campaign. But there's no multilateral solution there that was able to remove Maduro. And so based on this real quick, like fly through history of defense and security in the region, there's a few threads I want to talk about. So you've got U.S. unilateralism, right? So when the Rio Treaty signed in 1947, the United States has conducted major interventions, had conducted 9 major interventions in the preceding 100 years. 30% of the countries participating in the conference had endured at least one U.S. intervention. And depending on how you count it, you could have the number of interventions since 1810 by the United States in the hemisphere. It could be 80. And at least 19 of those are what you would probably consider a major incursion, like Marines, long-term occupation, Panama, these kind of things. So 19. So U.S. unilateralism is a key component of how this region has operated. Although I would say that this has changed over time. But understanding that U.S. unilateralism is part of how we think about relations in the hemisphere and how the hemisphere looks at us, or looks at the United States. And then the region took a unique approach to U.S. unilateralism. And this is what I think is really interesting and really important for like U.S. security and our understanding of the global security environment is a lot of international relations theorists would tell you, okay, the United States is super powerful in the region. When countries become super powerful, this creates balancing. If you want to take Walt's approach, they have to be a threat to get balanced against. Well, with a number of unilateral interventions, I think you could argue that the U.S. is threatening, at least to some people in the region. And yet, the region doesn't really embrace balancing. Like, you don't see an alliance forming to counter the United States influence in the region. It just really hasn't happened. And they've taken a unique approach. They've chosen instead to bind to the United States through diplomatic instruments. And so Javier Corrales and Richard Feinberg have explained it pretty clearly. They say that the region insisted on relying on Pan-American institutions to deal with the United States and one another and codifying the norm of non-intervention and consultation. So they put all these things together to try to create a situation where the U.S. doesn't do unilateral action and they're forced to kind of negotiate differences before the countries in the region resort to armed conflict. And a lot of times you'll hear people in the region refer to the region as, the region of peace, right? So, and then key also to what's going on today is that there's been studies done where when the U.S. is engaged in unilateral activity, countries in the region are less likely to adhere to the United States, as in they're less likely to support U.S. policies. They're less likely to support the United States in its global positions. So U.S. unilateralism could weaken some of those ties that we've developed over time. And this ties into the next thread, which is Latin Americanism versus hemispherism. Again, this is Corrales and Feinberg had the hemispherism, which is kind of a word. I'm using it all the time as a word now. But like I talked about, the hemisphere once they got done with all the revolutions, they were very frightened about, they didn't want the Europeans coming back in. And there were a couple schools of thought about how to do this. So one was hemispheric. And so you have Juan Engaña, who's a Chilean legislator and philosopher. From the very beginning, he pushes for a hemispheric wide structure, which would include the English speaking United States. There's other folks that want to do like a Spanish speaking, Spanish, culture structure for defense, where, and sometimes this includes Brazil, sometimes this doesn't include Brazil. And sometimes you see indications that they're wary of the United States as a potential threat. But you have these two visions, like the entire hemisphere comes together, including the English speaking nations, or the other one, which is kind of a Latin American one, but maybe like sometimes Brazil, sometimes not Brazil. Simon Bolivar actually holds the Congress of Panama in 1826 to try to build this hemispheric structure. Uh, the historians are kind of split on whether he wanted the United States to attend this conference or not. We'll just say reluctantly he invited the United States, and then by the time the United States got their delegation together, they didn't make it to Panama in time to participate, and then Brazil also didn't participate. So it kind of like doesn't happen. And then we kind of flirt with it from time to time over the years. But in the end, hemispherism starts to gain strength. Pan American organization, these economic agreements and trade agreements start to build ties between the countries. And then eventually, hemispherism, you could say wins, but it's not a complete win. It's not a permanent victory with the Rio Treaty and then the OAS Charter. It's kind of a decision that's made that, hey, we're going to work together as a hemisphere to solve problems. But that dynamic, this split between hemispherism and I'll call it, Latin Americanism, it still exists today. And outside powers love Latin Americanism. So the term Latin America, you may not know this, was actually the French came up with this thing, and they like to kind of spread this term around. They popularized it to try to split English-speaking countries from the rest of the hemisphere. So rather than referring to the hemisphere as the Americas, they preferred to call it, Latin America and then like North America. And you see it in how people talk about divisions in the hemisphere. And so if you're an outside power, you want Latin Americanism, you don't want hemispherism, because hemispherism indicates unity, which includes the United States. And yet still we have organizations that are designed to cut the United States out. So the most important one that I'll point out is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. So CELAC excludes Canada and the United States intentionally. You've got other ones like UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. That's just South America. And then the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America was started by Hugo Chavez. That's kind of defunct now. Hugo Chavez kind of built this thing up and helped build that thing with oil money and oil, donations. That was as close as I think we've come to kind of, in the recent years anyway, of people coming together against the United States, of balancing against the United States. But this thing continues, this idea of should we be a hemisphere? Should we solve problems as a hemisphere, or should we solve problems in smaller groupings that are more exclusive? And then the last thread is non-intervention versus democracy, which to me, this is this tension that we just can't seem to solve in the hemisphere. Now, the Rio Treaty and the OAS Charter make it clear that intervention is not allowed in the hemisphere. You can see the quote there, like you can't intervene like for any reason whatsoever, according to the OAS Charter. Non-intervention is like it is a key component of the Organization of American States Charter, and how the region thinks of itself and what's allowed and what's not. And a lot of this comes from the countries in the region that faced intervention. Especially Mexico has a very strong policy on non-intervention because they've had so many interventions, and a lot of the other countries are the same way. So non-intervention is a key component there. But then they have the Democratic Charter that they signed in 2001. Actually, on September 11th, 2001, they signed it. A lot of similarities to kind of the Bogotazo and the 1948 conference in Bogota. So this new document, the Democratic Charter, means that they have to promote and defend democracy. So there's no like really coercive measures in there, but there is a mechanism where you can apply diplomatic pressure if a country starts democratic backsliding, and you can kick them out of the OAS. So there's a little bit of a coercive mechanism there, but not really. And there's a way where you can start talking about getting to not necessarily military force, but pressure to try to keep a country democratic. But it's not laid out clearly in the Democratic Charter. And so what you have here is a gridlock as far as multilateral problem solving goes. The Democratic Charter demands the region maintain democracies. The OAS Charter strictly limits the ways and means available to do that. And so when you have something like a Maduro Venezuela, that is just this festering wound in the hemisphere that's like shedding millions of migrants and damaging economies throughout the region, it's completely corrupt and running drugs out of there, supporting insurgency next door in Colombia. The region just can't seem to deal with it. Like the region multilaterally just can't seem to figure out a way to solve the problem. And so this ties in with U.S. unilateralism because the U.S. gets frustrated. And I think one of my favorite quotes on this comes from John F. Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, the failure at the Bay of Pigs invasion, or covert action, or whatever we want to call it. So he makes a speech where he highlights U.S. restraint, but he warns, should it ever appear that the inter-American doctrine of non-intervention merely conceals or excuses a policy of non-action, if the nations or this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation. And that's not that far from what the Deputy Secretary of State said at the OAS just recently about how the OAS needs to take action or we're just going to do it ourselves. What's the use of the OAS if you can't solve problems? So this is an ongoing problem in the hemisphere. Okay, so that was a long road. I've been talking a lot, but I want to really quick close it out with what's next here, some things to look at. So we're seeing a regression to the early 20th century Roosevelt corollary. I would say even more aggressive than the Roosevelt corollary because we have more of a, feels like we have almost a more of an imperialistic kind of motivation here versus a exclusionary piece of it. Now, there is an exclusionary piece in that we don't want China in the hemisphere, but some of this stuff that's been going on seems more designed about increasing U.S. power rather than being exclusionary and defensive. So we're seeing like the Roosevelt corollary, but the Monroe Doctrine is even more aggressive, I think. Some states in the region appear to be going along with the Trump administration's agenda, but Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, some of the most important, if not the most important countries in the region, were not at the Counter Cartel Conference, nor were they at the Shield of the Americas, so they weren't present. Historically, U.S. unilateralism leads to weakening of ties with the United States, so this could accelerate moves by some countries in the region to look to diversify their international relationships, including in trade and defense. Now, who would they diversify to? Well, China has displaced the United States as the number one trading partner in South America. I was in Brazil, I think last year, and I was sitting on the beach talking to a friend of mine, and we went to Georgetown together. And I asked him, I was like, "Hey, if something happens in Taiwan, is Brazil going to be there for us?" And he just like laughed and almost spit out his beer. And he's like, "Absolutely not." He's like, China's our number one trading partner, and you will never be able to replace the economic damage that we would do to ourselves by siding with you in a war with China. And I think that China is here, right? Like China is the number one trading partner in the region. They're very close with Brazil, and in Latin America overall, they're number two, only second to the United States. The countries in the region with CELAC, they have a CELAC China conference that they do every year, and China pays attention to it. Xi comes to that conference. He's either there virtually or he shows up in person. Like China's interested in CELAC China as an inroad for them to make engagement with the region that excludes the U.S. and Canada. And then also you have a number of countries that are now identified as comprehensive strategic partners. There's 21 countries in the region are Belt and Road Initiative signatories, although Panama just dropped out because of U.S. pressure. Russia's had a harder time now with Ukraine going on, but in the past 10 years, they'd given Venezuela 1.2 billion in military assistance in weapons, and then the rest of the region they got about 488 million provided in Russian weapons throughout the region. And then just to get a little bit more into Brazil, since World War II, Brazil has been charting a path towards great power status, right? And it's been limiting its dependence on the United States. Post World War II, we made a lot of promises to Brazil as far as economic development and improving their military, and not all of that came to pass. And I think that they're like, hey, it's time to chart a new course, and that's what they've been doing. In 2001, you have that Goldman Sachs paper that puts Brazil alongside Russia, India, and China as these large emerging market economies, the BRICS. And the BRICS, kind of unbelievably, even though they're very different countries, have managed to come together. And Brazil is kind of excited about creating an alternative structure for economics that is outside of the US-led economic order. So Brazil is interested in this. Brazil sees itself as part of an emerging world order, a multipolar world order, where they get a seat at the table. I don't think Brazil is excited about being, the sidekick to the United States. And where they used to have a policy up until after World War II of, kind of these two sister republics of the Western Hemisphere side by side, and the U.S. as a special partner, that's really eroded to the point where you can almost not see it anymore. Um, and the other piece here that's important is Sean Burgess calls something that Brazil is doing in South America. They're seeking consensual hegemony, where they're not like forcing the countries in South America to kind of allow them to lead. But the idea here is they're so economically powerful, they're so useful, and they're so tied into all these countries that the countries just allow Brazil to lead in South America. And you could see something where if, in my conversation with some Brazilians, where if the U.S. ends up for whatever reason putting a large number of troops into Venezuela, just like the Brazilians were very unhappy with Plan Colombia happening, you're going to see Brazil get kind of prickly if the United States starts doing more in South America. Um, and so I guess that ties, and then tying in with the second point, the current U.S. policy is essentially sidelining the OAS and the Rio Treaty, opting for this coalition approach. Um, I wouldn't count the OAS out. So the OAS is resilient. It's been around since 1947. There was one critic that put it this way, which I think is pretty funny. He said, the Organization of American States would never be accused of a do or die attitude because it seldom does, yet it refuses to die. So the OAS is sticking around, but I wouldn't say we should just take for granted that it's going to stay where it is or that it's going to retain that kind of level as the accepted mechanism for working through problems in the hemisphere. The U.S. policy of this kind of sub-regional coalition can be useful for problem solving, but depending on how this goes or how those splits form, it can cause erosion or fractures within this hemispheric structure and lead to these kind of different groupings of countries. And maybe the most dangerous version of this is, so Secretary Hegseth in his remarks referred to a greater North America, which would go down, which would include like the Caribbean and Central America. And this isn't like an unknown, this isn't a new idea. And I don't know who put that in his talking points. People have referred to it as the American Lake before, that's really the sphere of control of the United States. So if we, and in the Trump administration, there's been a lot of commentary about this spheres of influence policy for national security or for foreign relations. If the sphere of control that the United States is seeking isn't hemispheric, but rather just this extended North America, you could see a rift form with South America and Brazil, a Brazilian-led South America take shape. I don't know how much of this is going to come to pass, but that's kind of something we need to be watching is with this new coalition structure that they're trying to work through. How does that work? How does that hold together? And then what rifts might that create that could damage hemispherism and the existing mechanisms of the OAS and the Rio Treaty? Some other things to watch here are CLAC. So we want to see, is the OAS declining in importance and is CLAC increasing in importance? Now, when I've talked to diplomats about these different organizations before, they're like, hey, they pop up, keeps all these kind of malcontents busy. They've got some new organization they can build and mess around with and waste their time with. The reality is the OAS is the real thing. It's got a bureaucracy, it's long-standing, it's sticky. These things are just people just play with these other organizations and then they end up disappearing. CLEC's been around for a little while now, and depending on what happens with this administration and what the policies are, that's something we need to watch. Is does CLAC grow in importance and does OAS decline in importance, and how much is that happening? Elections also matter. So Brazil's got elections coming up in October. Lula da Silva was looking like he was going to win that thing, but that has tightened up considerably. So if you have like a Bolsonaro candidate win there, you could see Brazil shift to be part of this coalition that the Trump administration is putting together. And then in Colombia with Petro, who's been fairly hostile to Trump, that election, he can't run for re-election, but his party's going to run. So they have first elections in May and then probably going to a follow-up in August. That was looking like the right or a right-leaning party was going to win that, but that has tightened up. And some people are saying that's because Petro was confronting Trump on his policies in the region, so he gained some percentage points. I'm not sure exactly what's happening there, but for whatever reason, that has tightened up as well. But if you see Colombia and Brazil swing right, that's going to bolster this coalition that the Trump administration is putting together. And so you may get a window where a number of these states will be able to come together and do things in support of this counter cartel coalition. But we'll see, or they'll at least maybe sign it. We'll see how much they actually do. But we want to take a look at that. And then in Peru, you have Fujimori, the right-leaning candidate, just came out on top in the first run of that election. Although presidents in Peru haven't lasted long, and the Congress seems to have some dominance in the bureaucratic sphere there. But we want to watch that. And in Latin America, at least over recent years, you'll see like you'll have a big swing. You'll have like we just had the pink tide, and now we're swinging back to the right. So there's all these trend lines where sometimes the elections swing different directions. All these governments came out post-COVID with a lot of unhappy populations that voted some governments out that maybe would have not been voted out before. But anyway, so we could see some changes in elections, and that's going to dictate how successful some of these strategies are that the Trump administration have. Mexico is not going to change right away. Morena is still firmly in control of Mexico, and Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be in there for a while longer. So Mexico, even if Brazil and Colombia switch to a more right-leaning governments, Mexico is going to stay where it is and continue to try to work with the United States or manage its relationship with the United States. And then lastly, I think this incompatibility between the Democratic Charter and the OAS Charter, that's going to continue. And as long as the multilateral instruments in the hemisphere can't solve tough problems, it's going to lead to, if you have someone in the administration, that wants to take action, the United States will engage in unilateral action. Or best case, they'll bring in some allies to help them with it. Although they had zero allied support, I think, for what they were doing with the Maduro raid. That was a purely unilateral action. And then finally, the next target on the list is Cuba. I don't know after Iran if we have the bandwidth to do that. If we're interested in trying to do regime change in Cuba, President Trump has said that he wants to do this and that the Cuban government is going to fall and that he's going to take Cuba. I don't know if we have the appetite for that now post-Iran, but we'll see. Marco Rubio, I think, really wants to do this. I think Marco Rubio, he has a personal interest in freeing Cuba, breaking the communist rule in Cuba. So I think within the bureaucratic space, him being the new Kissinger, being the national security advisor and the Secretary of State, I think he's intent on taking action in the Western Hemisphere. And there's folks that are tying things together between, the Maduro government and Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Mexico. And there's an effort here to kind of get the oil, cut Cuba off from oil from Venezuela, which they've managed to do. And then the next step of that would be to go after Cuba. But we'll see if they have the bandwidth to do it. And it'll be interesting if they, how they try to put that together. Okay. So I've talked for a really long time. And I think usually, when I deal with my classes at U of A, here at University of Arizona, I normally check the news right before class just to see what's going on. And we normally go into a lot of question answer versus my normal just kind of lecturing because there's so much changing every few minutes in the world today. So I'm happy to take your questions. There's plenty of stuff I didn't cover. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.